The desert heat was still heavy, even though the sun had gone down. Las Vegas, 1970. The kind of night where the neon burned brighter than the stars and the air smelled like cigarette smoke and expensive perfume. Outside the Sands Hotel, a line of black cars sat idling. Engines running. Doors closed. Men in dark suits standing nearby, watching the entrance. Inside, in a dressing room backstage, Frank Sinatra sat in front of a mirror. His bow tie hung loose around his neck. His shirt was pressed. His jacket waited on a hanger behind him. In 3 hours, he would walk onto that stage. The room would go quiet. The spotlight would find him. And he would sing. But right now, he was listening to someone he didn't want to hear. The FBI agent stood near the door. Mid-40s. Clean cut. Calm. He'd been talking for 5 minutes. And Frank hadn't looked at him once. Just kept adjusting his cufflinks. Smoothing his hair. Staring at his own reflection like the man behind him didn't exist. "Mr. Sinatra, we have credible intelligence that there may be a threat tonight," the agent said. His voice was steady, professional. "We'd like to position 2 agents in the venue. Plainclothes. You won't even know they're there." Frank's jaw tightened. He reached for his glass of whiskey on the counter and took a slow sip. "I don't need a babysitter," he said. The agent didn't move. "This isn't about what you need, sir. It's about what we know." Frank set the glass down. Hard. Not loud enough to break it, but loud enough to make a point. "I've been singing in this town for 20 years, he said. "I've played rooms full of guys who'd kill you for looking at them wrong. I've had mob bosses sitting front row. I've had people scream at me, threaten me, follow me home. And I'm still here." He turned in his chair, looked at the agent directly for the first time. "So whatever you think you know, I've already lived through worse." The agent nodded, slowly, like he'd expected this. "I understand, Mr. Sinatra, but the people we're concerned about tonight aren't the kind you've dealt with before." Frank smiled. Not a warm smile, a cold one. "You think I don't know who wants me dead?" he said. "You think I don't know who I've pissed off? I know exactly who hates me. And I'm still walking onto that stage." The agent hesitated. He glanced at the door, then back at Frank. "We're not asking you to cancel," he said. "We're asking you to let us do our job." Frank stood up, slowly. He wasn't a tall man, but in that moment he seemed to take up the entire room. "Your job," he said, "is to worry about the president, about senators, about people who matter to the government. I'm a singer. I don't need the FBI following me around like I'm some kind of target. You are a target, sir." The words hung in the air. Frank didn't flinch, didn't blink, just stared at the agent with the kind of look that had made grown men back down in poker games and boardrooms and late-night arguments in places most people never saw. "Then let them take their shot," Frank said. The agent opened his mouth to respond, but Frank raised a hand. "I'm not changing my life because someone out there doesn't like me," he said. "I'm not hiding. I'm not canceling. And I'm not putting armed guards in my audience. This is my show, my stage. And I'll be damned if I let fear run it." The agent looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not in agreement, in resignation. "I'll be outside if you change your mind," he said. He left. The door clicked shut, and Frank was alone. He sat back down in front of the mirror, picked up his whiskey, took another sip. His hand was steady. His face was calm. But there was something in his eyes, something hard, something that had been there for years. Frank Sinatra was not a man who bent easily. He'd grown up in Hoboken, scrapping for every break, every gig, every chance to be heard. He'd climbed to the top of the world, fallen hard, and climbed back up again. He'd been cold, washed up, finished, irrelevant. And he'd proven them all wrong. But the cost of that kind of pride was high, because Frank had made enemies. Real ones. Not just critics or jealous competitors, but dangerous people. People with connections. People with reasons. He'd walked away from powerful men who didn't like being walked away from. He testified in front of Congress about organized crime, carefully sidestepping questions, but still showing up when others refused. He'd been photographed with mobsters, accused of being their friend, their tool. And when he tried to distance himself, when he tried to prove he wasn't owned by anyone, some of those people took it personally. Very personally. The FBI knew this. They'd been watching Frank for years, not because they thought he was a criminal, but because they thought he was in danger. Because the people around him, the people who'd helped him rise, who'd filled his clubs and booked his shows and made sure his records got played, some of them didn't forgive easily. And some of them didn't forget. But Frank had made a choice a long time ago. He would live his life on his own terms. He wouldn't bow. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't apologize for being who he was, even if it killed him. 3 hours later, the showroom was packed, every seat filled. The lights dimmed. The band began to play. And Frank walked onto that stage like nothing in the world could touch him. The crowd erupted. Applause, cheers, whistles. The sound of 1,000 people who had come to see a legend. Frank took the microphone, smiled, and began to sing. His voice was smooth, effortless, the kind of voice that made people forget their problems, forget their lives, just sit there and listen, and feel something they couldn't name. He sang Fly Me to the Moon. He sang My Way. He sang New York, New York, and the crowd loved every second of it. But in the back of the room, near the bar, 2 men stood watching. They weren't clapping. They weren't smiling. They were just watching. One of them wore a dark jacket. The other had his hands in his pockets. They didn't look at each other, didn't speak, just stood there, eyes fixed on the stage. Frank didn't see them. He was focused on the performance, on the music, on the connection he had with the audience. That's what he lived for. That's what made all of it worth it. But halfway through the set, something happened. A man in the front row stood up. Suddenly, quickly. His hand went to his jacket. The bodyguards Frank had insisted he didn't need moved fast. One grabbed the man's arm. The other stepped in front of Frank. The band kept playing. But the energy in the room shifted. People turned. Whispered. The man was pulled away. Quietly. Efficiently. And within seconds, it was over. Frank didn't stop singing. Didn't acknowledge it. Just kept going like nothing had happened. But his hand, the one holding the microphone, was gripping it a little tighter. The man who'd been removed wasn't armed. He'd just been drunk, excited, trying to get Frank's attention. But for a few seconds, no one knew that. For a few seconds, it could have been something else. And Frank knew it. After the show backstage, Frank sat in the same chair, the same mirror, the same glass of whiskey. But the room felt different now. The FBI agent was back, standing in the same spot, saying nothing. Frank looked at him in the mirror, didn't turn around. "You were right," he said quietly. The agent didn't gloat, didn't lecture, just nodded. "We'd still like to provide protection, Mr. Sinatra." Frank took a slow breath. He didn't want to say yes, didn't want to admit that maybe, just maybe, he couldn't control everything. That maybe the world had gotten more dangerous. That maybe the people who wanted to hurt him were closer than he thought, but he also wasn't a fool. One guy, Frank said. Plain clothes, stays out of my way. The agent nodded. Done. Frank turned in his chair, looked at him directly. But if anyone asks, I didn't ask for this. You insisted, you understand? The agent smiled, just a little. Understood, sir. He left. And once again, Frank was alone. He stared at himself in the mirror. The same face, the same eyes. But something had changed. Not in him, in the world around him. Because the truth was, Frank had always believed he was untouchable. That his talent, his fame, his refusal to bow down would protect him. And for a long time it had. But talent doesn't stop a bullet. Fame doesn't stop someone who's been waiting for the right moment. And pride, no matter how strong, doesn't make you invincible. Frank knew this now. Not because someone had told him, but because he'd felt it. In that moment, when the man stood up. In that split second, when he didn't know what was about to happen. He'd felt mortal, and for a man like Frank Sinatra, that was the hardest thing to accept. The shows continued, night after night, city after city, and every time, there was someone watching. An agent in the crowd, a bodyguard near the stage. People Frank pretended not to notice, but knew were there. He never thanked them, never acknowledged them publicly. But he didn't refuse them anymore either, because he'd learned something that night in Vegas, something he'd spent his whole life avoiding. You can be strong. You can be proud. You can refuse to let fear dictate your choices. But you can't do it alone. And there's no shame in accepting help, even if it means admitting you were wrong. Frank never talked about that night, never mentioned the FBI agent or the protection he'd refused, or the moment in the showroom when everything could have gone wrong. But people close to him noticed a change, a quiet one. He was a little less reckless, a little more careful. Not afraid, but aware. He still sang the same songs, still commanded the same stages, still lived his life on his own terms. But he did it with the knowledge that some threats are real. Some dangers can't be charmed away with a smile and a song. And sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is let someone stand beside you. Years later, when Frank was asked about that night, about why he'd changed his mind, he gave a simple answer. I got tired of being stubborn, he said. Figured it was better to be alive and proud than dead and right. He smiled when he said it. That same cold smile. But underneath it, there was something else. Relief. Because he'd come close. Closer than he wanted to admit. And he'd walked away. Not because he'd backed down. Not because he'd been defeated. But because he'd been smart enough to know when pride was just another word for foolish. And that night in Vegas, 3 hours after refusing protection, Frank Sinatra learned the difference. The hard way. But he learned it. And he never forgot.